Okay, students, this is your lecture for Thursday, May 31st. I'm going to cover sulfur, iron, boron, zinc, chloride, and then look at your last article about how mineral nutrition can affect plant disease. There are, in the module, after the handouts that we're finished with, there are 2 micronutrient video clips. There's one about sulfur, and I'm trying to think of what the last one is. I think there's one about iron as well. Okay, so there's 4 video clips that you can watch too. I just can't talk about them or use them on here because I can't get the sound to show up, so you'll need to watch those on your own. After that, and I'll post the video clip right after I will post this lecture right after all the video clips on there, and then below that will be some heavy metals and tissue testing, because I don't think I handed out the heavy metal handouts, so we'll cover that. You've got your quiz that's coming up. I would suggest you watch this lecture and at least cover the micronutrients in your handouts or iron before you try to take the quiz, because those are included on it. Okay, so we've gone through nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium and magnesium. So I know this article calls it sulfur the 4th major nutrient. It's usually classified as a secondary element, as it says here. So, but it is actually put right up there with calcium and magnesium, which is why I include it here before I start into iron. And some of your crops can take up as much sulfur as phosphorus. So it's sometimes one of the most important limiting nutrient in crop production. It says for several reasons, because higher crop yields require more sulfur, less sulfur impurities in modern fertilizers. So when we were producing fertilizers, there used to be a lot of sulfur in it, so we didn't have to apply as much. So now that they've cleaned them up, we have to apply sulfur. We're not using as many of sulfur-containing pesticides like the MSMA, DSMA. Those aren't used as much. And we don't have as many sulfur emissions in the atmosphere. And we also realize that most of our plants have a better uptake and nitrogen utilization when you have adequate sulfur. So what does it do within the plant? It's used in the formation of amino acids, proteins, and oils. It's involved in the chlorophyll molecule formation. It helps with nodulation in legumes, and it also helps develop and activate some of the enzymes and vitamins. Notice it is a structural component of 2 of the 21 amino acids that form proteins. Okay, so it's pretty important for a minor, a secondary element. It's still pretty important. Again, the crop's need for sulfur is closely associated with nitrogen, so the relationship between sulfur and nitrogen is not surprising, since both are components of proteins and are involved in chlorophyll formation. Okay, they are also linked by the role of sulfur in the conversion of nitrate to amino acids. So crops that have high nitrogen need will usually also have high sulfur needs. Okay, the majority of sulfur in most soils is contained in the organic matter. So this organic sulfur has to be mineralized to the inorganic sulfate anion before it can be taken up by crops. So the plant doesn't take up S by itself. It has to go to a sulfate. So when organic matter decomposes, the resulting sulfur release is affected by temperature and moisture, and generally conditions that favor crop growth also favor mineralization and release of sulfur. So sulfate, like most anions, is somewhat mobile in soils, and it could be subject to leaching. So if I have a condition where sulfur is most likely to be deficient, are low organic matter levels, coarse sandy texture with good drainage, and high rainfall conditions, which is very much a condition that we find on the western side of the mountains in Washington, not here. So sulfur can be deficient in other conditions as well. So let's just finish up this brochure here. Let's see if I can get that. Okay. So when you're making sulfur, I don't think I have it all the way in there. Let's move it over just a little bit. And maybe I need to pull that up. I thought I could get it all in. Okay. So when you're making sulfur fertilization decisions, you need to look at what your crop is that you're using in your yield goal, what your soil and plant analysis are for your tests, how much organic matter you have, your soil texture, and if you're getting sulfur from irrigation water or manure. So your high-yielding forage crops like alfalfa and hybrid Bermuda grass remove more sulfur than most grain crops, and they're very responsive. So when we test for sulfur, it's usually a measure of sulfate, and as with nitrate, N samples should be taken deeper than normal, so 0 to 2 feet, because of the sulfate mobility in the soil. And if you have less than 2% organic matter, they're more commonly sulfur deficient. Okay, but you can have it in other soils. Coarse texture soils are more apt to need sulfur, but finer texture soils can also be deficient. So you should look at the sulfur content in your irrigation water, since in some cases you can get significant amounts of sulfur. That's probably not the case here. Okay, there are several sulfur fertilizer sources available. Most soluble sulfur fertilizer contains sulfate, such as bisulfates, thiosulfates, polysulfides are also available. The most common insoluble sulfur fertilizers is elemental sulfur, which has to be oxidized to sulfate before the plants can use it. It's also pretty hot when you put it out, so you don't want to put it out on a hot day. It needs to be irrigated in. So when we put it out, we want to make sure we have water, adequate temperature, and aeration. Okay. It also is going to lower the pH, and we can use elemental sulfur to acidify the soil if we need to. So pretty much if we summarize all this, sulfur is an important component of complete and balanced crop nutrition. And we've noticed that we've needed it in the last few years, and you need to look at the different factors before you apply it. So some of the highlights that they gave us here were crops having high nitrogen need will usually also have high sulfur needs. You need to look at all your factors, organic matter, soil type, all irrigation water before you make applications. There are several sulfur fertilizer sources available. Ammonium sulfate is probably the most common that people use because it's quickly available, and the sulfur is already in the sulfate form. Okay, so that is the sulfur. Okay, the next thing I want to do, and I think I can get back into the module here. Oh, I'm trying to, there we go. Okay, so let's look at where we're at. I don't have the sulfur on there, but then, and then we've got, I'm going to go right to the sulfur uses in plants here. And then we'll go into iron, boron, zinc. And then after zinc, well, zinc deficiency in wheat, that's not coming up, so I'm not going to be covering that. But you'll notice that then here are the video clips: iron chlorosis, sulfur in aquatics, micronutrients. And this is where I'm going to place the video clip. And then after that, we'll have our heavy metals discussion, and then tissue testing, and we'll finish up with biotech. So we'll talk about when we're going to have our last test next week. So let's go ahead and look at sulfur uses in plants. See if I can bring this up. And I make it bigger. I'm not sure I can. So we're just going to go ahead and look at all the things we just talked about with our last thing that we discussed. So if we look at sulfur metabolism, we get sulfur is contained in amino acids. Cysteine and methionine are the two that are the most that it is a part of. Sulfur availability influences nitrogen metabolism and photosynthesis. It's involved in stress response as part of an activation. It's in sulfolipids, or the fats with sulfur in it. It's also involved in glucosinolates, which is in our photosynthetic process. That's a secondary metabolite. Notice it's involved in proteins, so structural features, so the folding of the proteins. It's part of vitamins. It's involved in the production of ethylene and some of the polyamines. And it's also involved in the structure of some of the other metabolism, or I should say other nutrient groups. There's an iron-sulfur cluster, so they kind of group together. And then you see that it's also involved in some of the plant processes. Okay, so let's see if I can go back and pick up the next one. Okay, so as we get into, I thought that would come up. Oh, here it comes. Let's see if I can move this over. So as we get into iron, that's the first of our micronutrients, and I did not hand out a specific handout on iron, but if you look at your summary sheet, you'll see that the older leaves will have intervenal chlorosis. Iron, as we look at pH, is not very available. It's a fairly immobile element. So what's going to happen is that when I have pHs that are more alkaline, it's going to tie up and absorb to the soil, tie up with with organic matter, and it's not going to be available to the plant. So one of the things that we can do is actually, since we just talked about sulfur, is acidify the soil so that the iron becomes more available. We also have elements called chelates, which actually bind the iron, so they close up that site so that it cannot adsorb to the organic matter or soil. And then as it breaks off, then it becomes available to the plant. The other thing that you have a little a sheet on, and maybe I can, let's see if I can just, there are structures called siderophores. Some people say it's siderophore, so however you want to say it, I will let you do that. So I just took this, I gave you this handout. And basically, it says iron is although iron is the fourth most abundant element in the Earth's crust, it's not readily available to bacteria or to plants. So it usually occurs in the soil as insoluble precipitates, so that they can't get a hold of it. And bacteria actually produce these siderophores, or if you want to call them siderophores, to be able to assimilate iron from the environment. So most of our iron is found intracellularly in our proteins, in our blood, for within humans, and in our chlorophyll molecule. So it's an iron storage compound. When we get outside the cell, it's tightly bound to proteins. And that's why we find that we need to have a mechanism to move iron into the plants or even within our own system. So these siderophores have a high affinity for iron and are able to solubilize and transport Fe3+, the ferric iron in the environment, and compete for iron. So they used these siderophores, or siderophores, to basically bind the iron to them so that they can be make the iron available to the plants themselves. So there are different types of siderophores, and I'm going to put this down. And so what I wanted to look at is they're taken up differently. Iron is taken up differently in, I'm using the camera and I don't need to, in different types of plants. So here is a paper for specific uptake system for iron, phytosiderophores and roots of grass plants. So phyto just means plant. Okay, so if we look at this, let's just go through the abstract very quickly and you can go through the rest of it. So if we have a grass that's deficient in iron, it says roots of grasses in response to iron deficiency markedly increase the release of chelating substances, phytosiderophores, which are highly effective in solubilization of sparingly soluble Fe3+ compounds by formation of Fe3 phytosiderophores. So they looked at barley and the rate of iron uptake from those phytosiderophores is 100 to 1,000 times faster than the rate from your synthetic iron chelates, which you'll see that there are iron chelates for sale on the market. And you see they just tie them up with a diamine and an acetate, so it fills up that molecule, as I said, that space, so it can't become insoluble in the soil. Or microbial iron siderophores, ferrochrome. So one of the things they talk about is it says reduction of Fe3+ is not involved in the preferential iron uptake by these phytosiderophores by barley. It says this is indicated by experiments with varied pH, so they raised and lowered it, addition of bicarbonate or of a strong chelator for the iron. So the results indicate the existence of a specific uptake system for Fe3+ phytosiderophores in roots of barley and all other gramineous species. But it says in contrast to grasses, your cucumber plants or your other dicots take up iron from Fe3 phytosiderophores at rates similar to those from synthetic iron chelates. So basically there's not a difference in the rate. With grasses there's a much huger, it says, there's a much larger response, like 100 to 1,000 times more. Also, with iron deficiency in cucumber, the increased rates of uptake of Fe3+ phytosiderophores are based on the same mechanism as for synthetic chelates of iron. So, enhanced Fe3, iron 3 reduction and chelate splitting. So from this, they noted that there were two strategies evident for the acquisition of iron by plants under iron deficiency. Strategy 1, which happens in most non-gramineous species, so our dicots, is characterized by inducible plasma membrane-bound reductase and enhancement of H+ release. Okay, so that's what goes as we're talking about. It releases iron at the same rate as what we might get with a chelate. The strategy 2, which is involved in grasses, is characterized by enhanced release of phytosiderophores and by a highly specific uptake system for the iron 3 phytosiderophores. So this strategy 2 seems to have general ecological advantages over strategy 1, such as solubilization of sparingly soluble inorganic iron 3+ compounds in the rhizosphere and less inhibition by high pH. So the principal differences in the two strategies have to be taken into account in screening methods for resistance to Lyme chlorosis. Okay? So this is what makes it very, I should say, important in grasses for this specific uptake. Okay, there's also, let's just look, there's another, let's go back and I think I can do this. Go back to module. So we just did evidence for specific uptake. I gotta go back. Sorry, this is taking a little bit. Okay, this is the second paper that I gave you. And let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger too. Okay, and if I can move this down a little bit, will it let me? Maybe not. Okay, so this just talks about genotypic differences among the different grasses in release of phytosiderophores and uptake of the iron phytosiderophores. So if we look at this, and I apologize, it's a little bit grainy here, but we've already talked about grasses can enhance the iron acquisition from places where you don't have much iron availability by releasing of phytosiderophores, which will mobilize that Fe3+ by chelation. So most gramineous species, iron deficiency increases the rate of phytosiderophore release from the roots by a factor of 10 to 20, but in some species like sorghum, this increases much less. So the nature of those phytosiderophores can differ between species and even cultivars. So the different phytosiderophores are similarly effective as the microbial siderophore desferal, ferroxyamine B, methane sulfonate, in mobilizing your Fe3+ from a calcareous soil. So under the same conditions, the synthetic chelator, DTPA, which is what we use for iron, diethylene triamine pentaacetic acid, so DTPA is a chelation agent, it is ineffective. So the rate of iron 3 phytosiderophores uptake by roots increases, gramineous species increases by a factor of about 5 under iron deficiencies. So in contrast, your uptake of iron from both synthetic and microbial Fe3 chelate is much lower, and it's not affected by iron nutritional status of the plants. So the research they did here indicates that in gramineous species under iron deficiency, there's a specific uptake system for those iron phytosiderophores that is activated. And the specific uptake system for Fe iron phytosiderophores is absent in dicots. So if we look at a specific or a given gramineous species, the uptake rates for the various phytosiderophores, iron phytosiderophores, are similar, but basically they can vary by species by a factor of up to 3. And it says in sorghum, despite the low rate of phytosiderophore release, the rate of iron phytosiderophore uptake is particularly high. So the results indicate that the release of these phytosiderophores and uptake of the iron phytosiderophores are under different genetic control. And the high susceptibility of sorghum to iron deficiency, or what they call Lyme chlorosis, is most probably caused by low rates of phytosiderophore release in the early seedling stage. So in sorghum and other gramineous species, an increase in resistance to your iron deficiency due to higher pH could best be achieved by breeding for cultivars with high rates of phytosiderophore release. And they say that in corresponding screening procedures, attention should be paid to the effects of iron nutrition status and daytime on phytosidrophore release, as well as on rapid microbial degradation of phytosidrophores. Okay, so basically that's the why can't I get this to... I think I only put that one page, so I just wanted to go, obviously I just wanted to go over that very first page. So I'm going to close that and go back to the last piece on iron here. And this is just a picture of the iron strategies. I can get that to come up. Well, maybe I should just leave that out. I can do it better this way. Okay, so if we look at this, this is on the last page of that handout. So if we look at strategy number 1, up here, we've got lowering pH to increase iron solubility, and then iron 3 is able to be taken up, okay, by the plant. So acidification of the rhizosphere to solubilize the Fe3 provides substrate for the enzymatic ferric chelate reductase, which is right here, so it's reducing it, which in turn provides the Fe2 plus Fe2 for transport into the cell by this protein, the IRT1. So lowering the pH makes Fe3 plus soluble. We get the ferric chelate reductase, reduces Fe3 to Fe2, and then we have the IRT1 protein that allows it to go into the cell. So this is what happens in non-grasses. If we look here at the second one, strategy 2, okay, so this is what happens in grasses. Basically, your phytosidrophores, or your PS, will actually bind and solubilize the Fe3+, and these are produced by the root cells and released into the rhizosphere, and they don't really understand the mechanism. So I'll just say the PS bind to the Fe3 in the soil, and then the resulting compound then, or should I guess a complex would be a better word for it, because it is the phytosidrophore and the Fe3+, are taken up into root cells by the transporter at the membrane YS1. So it's a much simpler process. So you can see that this requires changing the pH, getting iron 3 to be reduced to iron 2, and then the protein allowing it across the membrane. And here the phytosidrophore binds to Fe3+, and the protein, the YS1 transporter, just allows it straight across the membrane. Okay. Okay, so that should do it for iron uptake. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more background in that it's not just simply iron deficiency, that there are other factors that are involved as well for uptake of iron within plants. Okay, so let's look at, we'll just go through, we've got boron, zinc, and I don't have it up here, but we're going to do chloride. I'll show and then talk about diseases. And the zinc deficiency in wheat is not there. So then I will put the video clip, actually, maybe I should put it right. Here are your 4 videos that you can watch about iron chlorosis, sulfur, and the 2 micronutrients. So I'll post the video that I'm recording now right above heavy metals. I think I already told you that, but I'm just trying to make sure that I don't forget to tell you what I'm doing as I go here. So, boron, this is also a video clip, so I'm going to put that down. Hang on. So we'll put boron down there too. So there are actually 5 video clips. So what I am going to do is switch back to the camera and go through our last few documents here on boron, zinc, and chlorine. Okay, so if we look at boron, and I have never seen a deficiency, but here it says that boron deficiencies, what you'll see is limited budding, bud break, distorted shoot growth, short internodes, increased branching, flower buds falling, and inhibition of fruit and seed development. I do understand, you guys can let me know in class on Friday. I know that there are very noted boron deficiencies in the berries, strawberries, raspberries, and so I'm thinking, Sager, I think it might have been you that said that there's you have problems with boron in grapes, but I'll let you confirm that. But basically, boron uptake by plants is controlled by the boron level in the soil solution rather than the total boron content in the soil. So it's a passive, non-metabolic process, so it takes no ATP. It moves with water, so you've got to have transpiration in the plant tissues and accumulates in the leaves. So boron uptake and accumulation are directly dependent on the rate of transpiration. Okay. As far as boron mobility in the phloem, it's now known to be plant species dependent. So you'd have to look up each individual plant to see how it might move in the phloem. Because basically with transpiration, that would be in our xylem. Okay, also, so here you can't really see the toxicity. But if we look here, you see it has chlorotic leaf tips, leaf necrosis. The plant just looks, the leaves are falling off, and it can be plant. So it says boron in soils, it shouldn't be is, it should be is, in soils can be categorized into 3 groups. Boron as a mineral component, boron adsorbed to soil particles such as clay or iron oxides, and it's reversible, so it can go into solution. And then boron that's in the solution is boric acid, H3BO3, and borate ions, BO3-. And the boron in soil solution is available mainly to plants as H3BO3. So the ratio between the boron concentration in the soil solution and the boron adsorbed to the soil particles is affected by the components in the soil, which is no big surprise. Clay minerals, free oxides. Okay, so the soil types. So most of the boron in soil is adsorbed to organic matter, acting as a pool of boron, so it can be readily released. Okay, so it says preventing boron accumulation in the root zone. And I can tell you on grasses, I've put 10-fold boron. I'm not seeing any toxicity, but with some plants, it is toxic. Okay, so it's important to keep a non-toxic level of boron in the soil solution. The root zone should be flushed either periodically or continuously if you're having a buildup of it. And the water amount and the irrigation intervals need to be determined in the same way done for treating salinity buildup in the soil, so you treat it the same. So if we look at boron sources, borax is a very commonly used. We used to have that used for soaps. That's 11% boron, boric acid. Solubor is another boron product. Notice that borax has 10 waters to it. Solubor has 4 waters to it, and it's probably the highest in percent boron. So make sure you have a deficiency before you add it in. Okay, so from that, we're going to go right to zinc in plants. So you've got video clips on both boron and zinc. Okay, it says here, whoops, I'll get this. Zinc is one of the 8 essential micronutrients needed by plants in small amounts, but crucial. So in plants, zinc is a key constituent of enzymes and proteins, and it plays a role in growth hormone production and internode elongation. So zinc deficiency is one of the most common micronutrient deficiencies in crop worldwide. So we can get some losses in crop yields and therefore human nutritional health problems. So yield can even be reduced by over 20% before any visual symptoms of the deficiency occur. So it's good to have a soil test done, and again with a tissue test. It's very important. It says the cost to the farmer associated with loss of production is by far higher than the cost of testing the soil and plant tissue. Zinc deficiency, because there's a delay in the transport of the zinc through the plant, zinc deficiency will initially appear in the middle leaves. Okay, and here are some of the symptoms for zinc deficiency. Stunted reduced height, intervenoclerosis, so it could look like iron. Brown spots on your upper leaves, distorted leaves. Okay, so the visual symptoms usually appear in severely affected plants. When the deficiency is marginal, it reduces the yields without any visible symptoms at all. So again, soil testing is going to be one of your main things you need to do. Okay, so to identify a zinc deficient soil, the plant and the soil should be tested. You could remain deficient in zinc for many years and not really realize that you've had a reduction in your crop yield. It affects many cereal crops, rice, wheat, and corn, as well as different fruit crops, vegetables, and other types of crops. So here are some of the soil conditions that can result in zinc deficiency. Low total zinc level in the soil, low organic matter content or too high organic matter content in peat soils, restricted root growth, maybe with a hard pan or a high water table, high soil pH, calcareous soils or lime soils, low soil temperature, waterlogged conditions or anaerobic conditions, and high phosphorus level in the soil. Okay, so zinc and phosphorus can be in competition. So how do we diagnose zinc disorders? Visual observation can help, but it requires expertise. And as I said before, we can already have a 20% yield loss before you see anything. So the best thing to do is have both a soil and a tissue test done. Ensure that zinc doesn't accumulate in the soil to high levels, because we can get toxicity as well. It says zinc toxicity is quite rare. Most soils have either normal or deficient levels. So the DTPA extraction is most commonly soil used. A commonly used soil test to determine available zinc levels in soils. And if you look here, you've got a table that with each crop, it tells you interpretation of your zinc levels in your plant tissue and of various crops. So zinc fertilizers can be applied to zinc deficient soils once it's been identified. Usually you're going to be using a zinc chelate, which is approximately 14% zinc. Zinc sulfate is 36% zinc. Zinc oxide, 70-80% zinc. But zinc sulfate is the most commonly used source of zinc. And again, be careful not to cause toxicity. So usually foliar zinc applications are not as effective as soil applied because of the way it's taken up. Okay? And again, usually with these micronutrients, especially what I've done in the past is with a very sandy soil like what we have on golf greens and things like that, is we usually will put out a micronutrient package in the spring and the fall, so twice a year. But we do also do that with tissue testing and soil testing to make sure, because it doesn't take very much. We have to make sure that it's available. So we're going to finish up looking at chloride and then a little bit on diseases, or how micronutrients can help limit disease, and that should be the end of this video clip. So chloride is also one of our essential micronutrients. But again, it's very small amounts. If we get too much, it can cause problems. It's very often associated with salinity, sodium chloride damage, and toxicity. So crops differ widely on their tolerance and need for chloride. They're going to be taking up from the soil solution, and it plays an important role in photosynthesis, osmotic adjustment, and suppression of plant diseases. However, high concentrations can cause toxicity problems in crops and reduce yield. Okay, so the toxicity is going to result from an accumulation of chloride in the leaves. Okay, so what are my toxicity symptoms? Looks like a necrosis of leaf margins and tips, and it's going to occur in the older leaves first. Excessive leaf burn might eventually result in leaf drop. Again, it's hard to distinguish. Sorry, that stupid ask a question thing came in here. It's very hard to distinguish if that's actually the problem. But you can also get damage from chloride when it's deposited on leaves from overhead irrigation as well. So usually in many cases, there's more than sufficient amount of chloride from the atmosphere and rainwater. It usually contains a low concentration of chloride, but chloride could become a limiting factor for plant growth in areas that are far from the sea. So natural sources of chloride in your groundwater include the weathering of rocks, atmospheric deposition and precipitation, and then in our coastal areas, available groundwater is saline. Chloride is also an anion, negative charge, so it doesn't absorb to the soil particles and is readily moved with water in the soil. So water quality and irrigation management are the major factors that affect chloride concentrations in the soil. Water of low to medium salinity contains 100 to 300 milligrams per liter of chloride. So if your water contains 100 milligrams per liter of chloride, irrigation of about 30,000 liters per hectare per day will result in an addition of 1,095 kilograms per hectare per year, or about 977 pounds per acre per year. Okay, so and this shows you the calculations for the chloride. Okay, when we look at chloride, I'll put this up here. Chloride is also a constituent of some fertilizers. The most common fertilizer that I can think of that, and they also talk about it here, is potassium chloride, muriate of potash, which has 47% chloride and 53% potassium. So it gives you a ratio, or it tells you what you would get if you put out 500 kilograms per hectare of potassium chloride or muriate of potash. So your other chloride-containing fertilizer would be calcium chloride, ammonium chloride, and magnesium chloride. So you do have those. So if we look at your classification of irrigation water, you can see that below 70 parts per million is usually safe for all plants. Once you get up to 140, you can have sensitive plants that show injury. You have moderately tolerant plants above 141 to 350. Above 350 parts per million, it can cause severe problems in your plants. And here shows your susceptibility ranges for crops for foliar injury from saline sprinkler water. And you can see that apricots, plums, tomatoes are pretty low. Or I should say they can't stand much chlorine. Peppers, potatoes, corn, medium. Your alfalfa, barley, and sorghum are high in their tolerance, and sugar beets and sunflowers can take probably the most chloride. Again, chloride doesn't bind to the soil particles. It can be tested in your aqueous extract, like a saturated paste, a 1 to 2 extract, or 1 to 5 extract to determine your chloride content. So you need to have your water tested and see what the level is. Excess chlorides need to be leached below the active root zone, just like what we talked about with boron and sodium. But water containing chloride concentration of less than 150 milligrams per liter of chloride are usually safe for most crops. as long as you use appropriate irrigation practices. Usually chloride is overlooked, and there are some positive responses to the application of fertilizers containing chloride in different crops in different parts of the world. Again, at higher concentrations, it can be toxic to many of the crops and contribute to salinity. So again, we need to manage our irrigation and fertilization management practices where your irrigation water contains higher concentrations of chlorides. Okay, so usually the water is going to be enough for us to use. Okay, so our last thing we're going to do is look at the article about mineral nutrition affecting plant diseases. Okay, so plant diseases are one of our most common limiting factors in ag production. It says most growers use high amounts of chemicals to control plant diseases, unaware to the fact that mineral nutrition has an important role in disease control. All essential plant nutrients influence the health of plants and susceptibility to diseases. If they're suffering a nutrient stress, they're going to be more susceptible to diseases. We do have some resistance of plants to diseases genetically, but the ability of the plant to express its genetic resistance to a particular disease is also affected by mineral nutrition. So some of our nutrients have a greater impact on diseases than others, but it says here it should be noted that a particular nutrient may have opposite impacts on different diseases and in different environments. So the same nutrient could decrease the incidence of one disease but increase the incidence of another. So they recommend soil pH, nitrogen forms, the availability of nutrients play a major role in disease management. So by using different cultural practices such as liming for pH adjustment, irrigation, organic amendments, tillage, and the best thing is to integrate all of these practices to get our best approach. So how can nutrient management or mineral nutrition prevent plant disease? So there are two resistant mechanisms. So you can form a mechanical barrier, thickness of your cell walls, by adequate nutrients, and you can actually synthesize natural defense compounds like antioxidants, phytoalexins, and flavonoids that are produced by the plant. So all diseases have a cycle of 3 to 5 parts, and any disease can be prevented or suppressed if that cycle is interrupted. So that's what we have to do, is look for how we can interrupt that cycle. So fungi penetrate the surface cells of the epidermis by passing between the cells or through them. Cell walls present a physical resistance to the fungus, and stronger cell walls can prevent infection. So certain nutrients like calcium play a major role in the ability of plant to develop stronger cell walls and tissues. Plants can also exude compounds, so when some nutrients are below a certain level, the released compounds contain higher amounts of sugars and amino acids that stimulate the establishment of the fungus because it has more food. Okay, so mineral nutrition also affects the production of antifungal compounds in plants. Bacteria can invade the plant tissue through wounds, sucking insects, and through stomata. So they have to have an opening to get in, whereas the fungus can penetrate the cell. Okay, so then the bacteria can spread within the intercellular space, and they release enzymes that dissolve the plant tissue. And calcium is known in its ability to inhibit such enzymes. So it can stop the growth or the release of the enzymes by the bacteria. So the ability of bacteria to spread within the plant depends on the strength of internal cells, which is greatly affected by mineral nutrition. Another mechanism in which bacteria spread within the plant is in the xylem, the vessels that transport water in the plant. So the bacteria can actually form a slime within the vessels and block them. So as a result, stems and leaves will wilt, bacteria wilt. Certain plants' nutrients suppress the ability of bacteria to form the slime, and calcium can help with that. Viruses are transmitted to plants by sucking insects and fungi. It was found that silicon, although it is not a plant nutrient, inhibits the feeding ability of some sucking pests like aphids, and as a result, virus infection is reduced by using silicon in the system. So they apply it. Okay, so let's look at some cultural practices. We have some diseases that are categorized as high pH or low pH diseases, high ammonium or nitrate types, high or low moisture. So cultural conditions that influence the form of nitrogen also affect soil pH and therefore disease development. So diseases such as verticillium wilt of vegetables, Phaemathotrichum, root rot of cotton, Thelovioopsis, root rot of tobacco are associated with alkaline soils. Scab is reduced in lower soil pH. Sulfur and ammonium are being used to decrease soil pH and reduce scab, while calcium, potassium, and nitrates may increase scab. Okay, and here's an example of same nutrient, different effects. There are different oxidation forms in the same nutrient that have opposing effects on plant disease. And nitrogen, sulfur, and manganese and iron are the examples. Nitrate and ammonium, nitrogen forms have different metabolic pathways and therefore different effects on plant disease. Okay, so depending on how the disease spreads, the type of nitrogen that you put out could either increase or decrease it. So some other examples. Adequate nitrogen levels are necessary for disease resistance, but excess nitrogen could promote plant disease. Why? Because excess nitrogen promotes thinner and weaker cell walls, increased plant density, and therefore high humidity, lower light conditions. Excess nitrogen delays maturity of plant tissues and increases the risk of disease infection and development. And then this should be imbalanced nitrogen-potassium ratio affects both the yield and disease resistance. Okay, and as we get to the summary here, potassium and the potassium-calcium ratio. We've talked about potassium being an important nutrient in disease prevention because it's involved in many cellular processes that influence disease severity or stress tolerance. It was also found effective in the prevention of bacteria, fungi, and nematodes. But excess potassium and a high potassium-calcium ratio could result in calcium deficiency and reduced resistance to diseases. So that lower calcium ratio can mean a thinner cell wall and less resistance to diseases. So if we look at all these, your mineral nutrition, cultural practices that affect it all play an important role in the prevention of plant disease and resistance of plants to diseases. So your balanced plant nutrition is the best plan to increase productivity, and they tried to talk about this in a succinct fashion on this handout. But you can't eliminate diseases by just adding one particular nutrient. You can decrease the severity of the disease by having adequate nutrition. So growers have to use a proper fertilizer program based on soil tests, plant analysis, and disease monitoring. And that's where I'll stop with this particular lecture. Okay? So you should have enough information after this to go ahead and take your online quiz. And again, you get 3 chances in it. You keep the highest grade. It'll open up on Wednesday at noon, but you may not, you need to view this video clip before you take the quiz. And then I'll be back again on Friday. And the quiz will still be open through Friday. Okay? Open Wednesday through Friday. So thanks. And if you have any questions, send me a message.